Thank you very much. All right, we good? So as Peter says, I'm talking a little bit about what we've been doing in Loot. This is starting with this, who we are. So I won't go into a lot of it, but the important thing is that we're game natives, so EA, Disney, Unity, Warner Brothers, Sega, those kind of companies, game natives, going into crypto for the first time. There's about 20 of us, a bit more than this slide suggests. We're in Brighton in the UK here. And our strategy when we set up the company a year ago is a couple of things really. The first one is that we should be doing Web 3, not Web 2.5. I see a lot of people coming from the games industry that take the games that they were doing before and add tokens or add NFTs to them and then say, you know, this is a blockchain game. And that might be profitable and, you know, good thing to do. But I think there's more interesting things if we challenge ourselves, really push ourselves out and do Web 3 things. And also we don't have a legacy, like we're not a Web 2 company that have made games moving into Web 3. So we have the luxury of being able to start afresh, if you like. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to release things regularly. I think it's important in a startup to release things quickly, regularly, but also particularly in blockchain where nobody really knows what they're doing yet. So rather than trying to second guess with a game that takes 2 years to make, we decided to get something out pretty quickly. And I guess the story of how we sort of got to Loot is like this, and I'm hoping most people are familiar with Loot. This is one of my loot bags on the right. So it's Loot is a set of, an NFT set of 8,000 loot bags, of which that's one on the right there. 8 items in each bag, as you can see. A different scarcity of those items across the 8,000 NFTs. There's no explicit function. This was really, I'll come on to it, but you know, there's nothing to do with the Loot NFT in and of itself when you get it. It was released last August. It's free to mint and currently held by about 2,500 people. Floor price today is about 1.5 ETH. So, as I said, there's a lot I could talk about Loot. I'm assuming most people know what it is, so I won't go into too much more detail. Honestly, when we first heard about it, we thought that's absolutely crazy. Why would you release an NFT for something that has no purpose? And the person, Dom, who released this NFT set, had no intention of making a game. It's something for a game, but I'm not going to be building the game, which seemed insane to us. But then we sort of sat on it for a month or so, by which time everything had been minted, of course, and we go, actually, there's something pretty interesting there. And also we felt that maybe it represented some of the things that we need to get our head around as Web 2 game developers learning about Web 3. So where we got to in the end, I think, is threefold, really. You know, it's designed for interoperability, and I think interoperability is going to be an important part of blockchain games. So that was interesting, the idea that it can be, this NFT could be used across a number of projects. That was weird and new. Permissionless. So there was no CEO of Loot that I had to speak to get a licensing agreement and non-disclosures and all. We could just do it. That seemed pretty interesting. And the third thing was that there's an addressable audience. So by the time we started building, there was already a Loot town square that happened every week. There's Discords, there's Twitters. So rather than starting from a cold start and trying to build an audience, then we had a set of people that we could start to talk to already who owned the Loot NFT or were just curious about that world. So it's sort of growth hack, if you like. So those are the 3 reasons why we thought that would be interesting to jump into. And what did I say? That's about 6 months ago. So we worked on a game called the Crypt. And the Crypt first chapter came out, I think, let's say January. And the plan was that we'd release new chapters of the Crypt every month. And so I'm going to talk about what we did, what the features were of each one of those chapters, what we learned from it. And it's been a great place to learn. I'll dive in. There's quite a bit of detail. First of all, I should explain what the game is. And in many sense, it's the simplest game that I've ever made. It's a really simple game, but we wanted to get something out quickly. And also, we're doing some weird stuff that we'd never done before and building a company at the same time. So we sort of managed the scope of what we were doing. So this is the Crypt. This is the landing page where you can connect your wallet. I'm going to try and explain how the game works now. Oops. When you're presented with 16 dungeons, you can see 8 of them here. And some dungeons, like this one, Dungeon of Power, has already been defeated. You can see some Dungeon of Brilliance here. I've already played the game, and I've inflicted 4 damage points on the Dungeon of Brilliance. Dungeon of Perfection, you can see I've got an option here that I can raid for 5 damage. So what does that mean, and how does that work? So if I click on Dungeon of Perfection, this is what I'd see. So on the right, hang on, I think it comes up. There we go. This is one of my loot bags, and you can see that there's 8 items in that loot bag, as you saw earlier. On the left, this is our dungeon that we created. It's actually a smart contract, and the dungeon has 8 attributes, just as the loot bag has 8 attributes. And if you can look, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but you can see that depending on what's in my loot bag, we'll have a greater or lesser chance of taking hit points from the dungeon. And so you can see that the platinum ring is going to take 2 points off demon spawn if I choose to raid. So I could choose to raid at this point and inflict 5 damage. And that's sort of how the game works. But really the game is more about the strategy that sits outside the game. So if I go back to the dungeons, then you can see that even though I'm just about to raid the Dungeon of Perfection for 5 damage, if you look at on the top row, you can see Dungeon of Titans. And okay, I can only raid that for 1 damage because the loot bag that I hold will only take 1 hit point off the dungeon. But you can see that it's only got 25 hit points remaining. And the sooner the dungeons fall, the better the prizes, the scarcer the prizes is. So if you took part in raiding the dungeon, then you would receive prizes from it. And if it was an earlier one that fell, then the items that you'd receive would be rarer and more valuable, if that makes sense. So a lot of the gameplay came from, right, who's raiding which dungeon, which loot bags have you got? I should explain that nobody has enough loot bags to completely raid the dungeon themselves, and you can only use your loot bag once. So the game really exists on Discord, where you're collaborating with other people, trying to create raiding parties, and getting people to cooperate on, we all going to hit the Dungeon of Titans? Let's do that one. Which loot bag have you got? Which one have you got? Okay, let's do it quickly. And that's sort of the game. So there's some strategy in figuring out which dungeon to raid and who I need to join my raiding party to do that. But importantly, that's all pushed outside the game, if you see what I mean. We just sort of set the stage for the game. If you defeat a dungeon, then you receive what we call our relics. Our relic is an NFT that has utility in future chapters and future games. And this is what I might win from the Dungeon of Perfection, is a gold skull. And then, because it sits on Ethereum and everything's on Ethereum mainnet, at least those first chapters, so the relic NFTs end up on Ethereum and then subsequently on OpenSea, etc. So before launch, here was the things that were going through our head, I suppose. Mainnet gas prices, gas price challenges. I'm sure people will be familiar with that problem. I think it was really twofold, really. The first was a technical. We're doing some quite, in that raid that I described, click here to raid a dungeon, there's some quite complex stuff going on. And we need to make sure that the gas price, we need to be careful with the coding of that such that the gas prices aren't $60 a raid. And that was a challenge, and we hadn't done that kind of stuff before, so that was a piece of work. The other one was around the game design. It's tough, or at least, to do a game design that doesn't require a lot of interaction with the Ethereum blockchain, requires a bit of thinking. So we deliberately had to design a game that you only really had one action to do, which is to raid the dungeon. And that took some sort of thought as to how we could create an interesting game that wasn't doing a lot of transactions on mainnet. Also had some technical challenges. Ours was the first on-chain co-op PvE game, I think, as far as I know. And it was our first game that we'd done, or at least the first game that we've done on-chain. There wasn't, I wasn't confident it was going to work perfectly. But anyway. Oh, and I guess the last thing, would anybody show up? Sure, we'd show up in the Loot Town Square and talk to people that we thought had loot, but it's not completely clear. And I'd have conversations with investors including Peter here, and saying, "Are you going to raid the dungeons?" And he said, "Well, we keep some of those loot NFTs. I'm not sure we're actually allowed to use them, though, because they're sort of a financial asset." And you realise there's some people that own these loot bags don't really have it and are looking to use it. So there was, we didn't know what was going to go on there. Anyway, after launch, so everything worked perfectly. Kudos to the team, many of which are here. Everything worked perfectly. Could have hoped for that to go better. It was beaten way too quickly, and this is both good and bad, I suppose. I'd imagine that these dungeons were going to stay up for about a month as people over the course of the month would attack them and come up with raiding strategies, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that it was beaten in 15 minutes by 50 superfans, which was awesome. We were like, "Oh shit, it's finished!" when we all went to the pub, But so it was a good day, or you could say really poorly balanced. But you can. Anyway, so what actually happened when we sort of dug into it was those super fans had reverse engineered our white paper and figured all this out ahead of time. So when we actually put the dungeons up, they just executed their plan perfectly. But in a way, that's cool and emergent, and we were happy with it. We found that and we knew this before we went into it, but we didn't really say what the relics were. The relics, if you remember, are the prizes that you win from raiding a dungeon. And we were never really clear what they were for. Traditional game developers don't like explaining what the game is going to be until they're really completely clear what it is. So we didn't really feel comfortable saying, this is what you are going to use your relics for in future, because we're still figuring that out. But as a result, they didn't really have a lot of transaction volume, and nobody knew how to price them. And I think it's good for expectations. What did I write here? Yeah, but bad for floor price, right? So, we weren't really looking to make money out of it, but that's something that we learned in the process, that until you're explicit about what it's used for, then I think it's hard to have a lot of transaction volume there. So, a couple of conclusions really from doing that was that our temptation, because it was beaten in 15 minutes, was like, let's put the dungeons back up again. That was fun, but I don't think that would really teach us anything new. So two things really. We decided, let's do things that grow the audience. 50 people playing the game was less than it's good and bad, but it was less than we expected. And so we want to do something that grows the audience to new players. And the second thing was, let's do things that teach us something new, technical, game design, whatever, rather than just repeating what we just done. So, chapter 2, 1 month later, where these are the ice relics, as in the second chapter. And here's some things that we did. One thing we said it uses more loot, and more loot is an extension of the loot NFT set. There's actually, I think, 1.3 million loot bags available, and many of which are still available to mint. And so, the barrier to entry. You didn't need a 1.5 ETH loot bag to play. You could go and mint something, or maybe you had a bunch of loot bags already. So we sort of lowered the barrier to entry there. Was one of the main things we did. The other thing we did was we said the first raid, as I said, all in chapter 1, all of the dungeons were defeated in 15 minutes. So here we said, okay, the first raid is free, but subsequent ones you need to pay 0.1 ETH. And this wasn't really to make money. That's not a high price to raid the dungeons. It was more really to modify the player behavior so people wouldn't just be consistently raiding and raiding and raiding. And we made the dungeons way harder, as you might imagine. So after launch, here's where we got to. 10 times the amount of people played. Still pretty small, like 500 people. But it did achieve the objective of get more people playing. 50% of people were paying to raid, despite the fact that we charge a fee to raid on the second time in a day. People would just continue to raid anyway. About half people were. We thought that was interesting. Our Discord, as we started to dig into it, it wasn't a busy, it's a good Discord. It's like 1,500 people, but they're all builders. So they really weren't there because it's not really a financially motivated project. I don't think the Lootverse is full stop really. It's more sort of experimental and full of builders. And when I talked to the people playing the game, often they were people that were building their own things in the Lootverse or their own blockchain games. And I think because we are one of the earlier on-chain projects, then it was as sort of interesting to other people that were building. So full of really interesting high quality people in our Discord. We have bots. which we predicted. If you build something on chain, then you can, we expect people to use our interface that you just saw. But equally, if it's on chain, you can just query it directly yourself and write a bot that interacts directly with our smart contract on Ethereum. And sure enough, by the time we get to chapter 2, then people were writing bots to try and optimize the raiding strategy. And as I said, we expected it, sort of hoped for it in a way, but it's interesting to see that emergent behavior where people are figuring, right, it's on chain, in which case I can game this in a different way. So that was one thing that we found. Super cool thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that in the raiding parties, there were traitors that said, yeah, we're going to raid this one, but then switched alliances to this one. And, I talked about this idea, trying to push the game into outside the game, if you know what I mean. And that was starting to happen in a cool way with subterfuge and double crossing and all that good, cool stuff. I think that if you're in those raiding parties, there's lots of drama and excitement. And to me, that's cool, Good, emergent behavior from good game design. So our conclusions on chapter 2 were, it's balanced correctly. Even now, I think there's still the last of the dungeons remaining, and that's better, I think, to have something that people can play with even now. So that was balanced much better. And we found that people would mint more loot bags in order to play. So we had this sort of reverse thing where people were looking at the game and then saying, all right, what more loot bags do I need to mint in order to beat this dungeon? And to us, that was interesting. I would say that although we increased the players, we didn't really bring more people into the Discord. That's it. Three conclusions. Okay, chapter 3. Chapter 3 we're about to release, so in fact we just put it up, but I think the dungeons open, they open on Thursday. Anyway, there we go, little plug. Jade chapter. So here's what we're doing in this chapter. We're using loot that I mentioned, and then more loot, which I've mentioned. Also this other loot project called Genesis Adventurers. And here's a interesting, cool new idea, at least for me in games, where we're taking something that in order to get a Genesis Adventurer, you need to play somebody else's loot experience in order to get this thing out, a Genesis Adventurer, that in turn gets used into our Crypt game. So now you've got this sort of interconnecting game between ours and theirs, and it's sort of centered around the loot NFT. So to me, that really is interoperability in action. To me, super interesting. And you need a combination to win. So, we talked about the gameplay where we sort of push it out to the Discord, and we're trying to do things to force people to coordinate. Who has a Genesis Adventurer? Well, I don't have one, but maybe if I did this, then I could do that, and then I could join you on the raiding party. So, it's forcing some gameplay outside the game again. Another thing we did, our gas fees on Ethereum mainnet were $20, which obviously depends on the price of gas on the day. But to us, that was pretty good. $20 didn't really stop people playing. But nonetheless, in an effort to learn something new technically, we figured out, can we do this in a more efficient way such that players don't have to pay gas fees? And somebody smarter than me on the team figured out that we could build a Polygon relay. So it's the actual computation, as I understand it, happens on Polygon. But everything is still on Ethereum mainnet, so it's completely invisible to the players, other than the fact that they have no gas fees to raid anymore. So an important factor of the third chapter is it's free to raid, if you see what I mean. So, and the third thing is, this is really about composability. So something else that's been built in the Lootverse is what's called the Rift, which is an experience point system, where the more that you play with your loot bag, the more XP it receives. And that's a smart contract. So our chapter 3 smart contracts are sort of composable, is that the way you say it, with the Rift experience point system, so that the two smart contracts are connecting. And to me, that's cool. Like we've never met the people that do the Rift XP system, but we just know them from their contract. They're sort of respected and is considered canon. And now we're interacting with it such that, do you see what I mean? Something cool and new there anyway. Conclusions. Now, we haven't put the third chapter out, so this is slightly premature. One thing we have worked out already is that StarkNet, ZK Rollup, is more scalable and future-proof than Polygon, in our opinion. So I'm definitely the wrong person to speak to about that, but we felt that, or at least our CTO felt that that's a better solution for us longer term. Also partly because other things in the lootverse are using StarkNet as a layer 2 solution, and it's a good idea for us to be compatible with that, but we like StarkNet. All right, and then some things that we're thinking about in the future. I'll do my usual Web 2, traditional games disclaimer. We might not do these things, but here's some of the things that we're thinking about. One is that we're thinking about these relics that people own, and still we haven't really said what anybody does with them, but people now own them. They're distributed amongst the people that are playing the game. So some ideas that we had is maybe in Chapter 4, Chapter 5, whatever, in order to play the game, you have to unlock a set of dungeons, and to get to dungeon number 2, you need to find somebody that's won a relic from a previous chapter to open that one up, and then find. Do you get what I'm saying? So really, you have to go back and say, right, who was it that won those things, or indeed, are there still from chapter 2? Are there still unclaimed relics that we can use to unlock this part of the dungeon, and to have a sort of more interwoven with previous chapters, I suppose you would say. Another one is. Can we I talked about the idea that when we put our Chapter 2 dungeons out, then we charged a raiding fee. It costs a small amount of ETH to actually raid the dungeon. So what about if we said if you own a relic or a certain kind of relic, then you can own one of those dungeons and publish it, and now other people can raid your dungeon, and you can take a fee from whatever the raiding fee is, if you see what I mean. And maybe we take a cut on that. I'm not quite sure, but certainly we're in a place where we could do that. Seems like an interesting idea. And another idea, I talked about our need to expand it out to more players. And one of the things that we think, sure, we've used loot, but what if we use treasure? What if we use Axie Land? What if we use Math Castles? We can really use any other NFT set, and we sort of like the idea of loot versus treasure. That seems like a war that's waiting to happen. I'd love to see that. So maybe that happens in our dungeons in the Crypt. And in general, I think game design that forces players to coordinate with each other creates some interesting gameplay. So more of that stuff, probably. Few sort of closing thoughts, I suppose, for them maybe, that didn't fit elsewhere. Some people, when I've spoken to investors or tell other people what we're doing, are you trapped in the lootverse? 8,000 people have a loot bag, so is that your addressable audience? And I do think that, we sometimes use the phrase internally, a born of the lootverse. I think that if we only appealed to people that understood what loot was, then we'd probably be in trouble. Or at least it's not really anything. It's a pretty narrow group of people that really understand what something as esoteric as loot is. So I think that we're using it more as a place to understand this world, this new set of things, and still be sort of respectful of that connection, and hopefully we continue to be in the lootverse, but equally we don't want to be trapped by it, if you see what I mean. So I can imagine that in future chapters and in future games, then if you know about loot, great, welcome to the party, but if you don't, that's fine, we got you too, probably is how it's going to work. Second thing is that permissionlessness, is that a word? Has its own issues, right? So I talked about the fact it's awesome we could just rock up and start making the Crypt using the loot NFT, and we didn't have to speak to anybody, signing any agreements. But a downside of that I didn't see, and has certainly been the case, is that because anybody can build anything around loot, well, what is canon? What is how do we know that this weapon beats this weapon in a loot bag? And all of these, there's like maybe 20, 30 different things going on in the lootverse, and there needs to be some consistency across it. But then anybody can do anything, so who is it? And it's not owned by anybody, so then who is, well, it's owned by everybody and nobody, if you see what I mean. So how can you figure out what's canon, what's lore? And a couple of things that we did, or at least have happened in the lootverse. One thing we wrote is a smart contract that sort of formalized some of the things that were implied in the original loot smart contract. So you could see that there was some implied grouping, like this set of weapons were bludgers or bludgeons, and this item beats this item because it's rarer. And we wrote a smart contract that then has been adopted by the Lootverse, and then that's sort of become law, if you see what I mean. Another thing that's been built by the Lootverse is what's called the Law Development Kit, LDK, which is sort of like, right, you want to be building on Loot, then here's a set of things that you should probably know about. And that's sort of another way that the Lootverse has tried to deal with that problem. But as I said, it has its own set of issues that I didn't anticipate. And there's a character, Tim Shell, in the Loot community that does an amazing job of trying to put this all together. But trust me, it's a job, you know. Third thing is that I most recently done mobile free-to-play, and we would buy 10,000 players and get them playing a game, and if they liked it, then great, we keep building it. If we didn't, then we just kill it, move on to another game, and that's how mobile free-to-play works. You can't really do that here. So on the one hand, we're talking about our our Crypt game being an experiment, but if people have paid gas fees or people have paid raiding fees, then you can't just throw those people away and say, oh yeah, we didn't want to do that anymore, or yeah, we're going to kill that game. You sort of have a duty of care to the players, and I think that's good. That's what we should. I mean, we don't have to, but it feels like the right thing to do when people are starting to spend money. And so there's something more of a challenge of saying, okay, how do we make sure we're respectful of the people that have played the game early, won relics? We need to make sure that if they won those relics, then there really is something to do with them in later chapters. So we have a sort of duty of care in that respect. I guess the fourth and final thing that I want to talk about is, and learning, I suppose, is this, which is, I think, I won't say that I know the whole universe of NFTs and everything that's going on, but I think really the Lootverse is the best example of interoperability and composability in games. I mean, it's really gloriously nerdy. You know, it isn't financially motivated. It's people trying to do weird stuff on-chain, doing things, game design that's never been done before. And if, when I first started in building blockchain games, I thought it was all about player ownership of assets and play to earn, and it is about those things. But I think it would be a shame if blockchain game, if that's all it was about. To me, I think there's massive, untapped, uncharted territory in composability and interoperability, but it's hard to find out where that's really happening in an interesting way in Web3. In our experience, it's happening in the Lootverse, and it's sort of served us really well to try and figure some of this stuff out. That's me. Thank you. Any questions?
Sorry.
Is the question is if we're planning on doing a DAO? Yeah, so your question is whether or not we'd interoperate with Treasure or move into that ecosphere. Yeah, I think so. It's some legwork moving across to they're Arbitrum, are they? Yeah. So, I think there's quite a lot of legwork building those bridges. And again, I'm the wrong person, but I think it's quite a lot of work building those bridges between those chains, and some security implications, I suppose, along the way. So I think it's an interesting idea. I'd love to do it. I think it's a bit more of a challenge because they just exist in different chains, on different chains. But I love the idea. And we also, something I should say is that we're building, as I said, the Crypt in a sense is a series of experiments, and we're building to something that looks more like a traditional game, using the things that we've learned in the Crypt, and we're sort of doing that alongside. I guess there's a balance for us as a studio, which is it'd be really easy just to think of tons of cool new ideas in the Crypt, but then we'd never finish the second game, so we'd have to sort of find a balance on that.
Awesome. We also love Treasure too.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you, David.
That
was awesome.
Thank you.